I'm going to be covering the eternal struggle of a swimmer in this talk. Swimming is one of the most repetitive sports, probably outside of running or maybe rowing. There's not many that are up there with swimming in terms of just the sheer amount of volume of the same repetitions. And even though there are different strokes in swimming, a lot of them still use roughly the same amount of joints in the same movement. So yes, there might be some variations between how the arms are recovering in a butterfly versus freestyle, but when you look at it muscularly and structurally, there's not that much difference. And so we need to make sure that we are aware of that. Number one, when we're doing dryland programs, is the volume that swimmers go through and just the sheer repetition of that volume, and particularly around a few joints. We're going to get to that in a second, but I want to back up a second first in terms of how you get better as a swimmer. There's a few ways. You can get faster, you could get better technically, or you could do more swimming. And so getting or improving as a swimmer, getting faster as a swimmer usually falls into one of those categories. You're either going to get faster, improve your technique, or just do more volume. Speaking of volume, if we just played out the math here in an average scenario, and again, I'm sure there's coaches out here who are coaching 8 and unders, senior citizens, Olympic gold medalists, probably everywhere in between. So I tried to take the average as best I could. So for an average swimmer, let's say they take 14 strokes in one lap. So that's 7 on each arm. And they say, let's say we do an average of a 4,000 yard practice. That's 160 laps. So in one practice, they're taking over 2,000 strokes. In a week, they're taking 13,000 plus strokes. In a month, if they're practicing 6 times a week, they're taking almost 60,000 strokes in a month. And in a year's time, it's almost 700,000 strokes. Just let that sink in for a second. That is a huge number of strokes. And you need to make sure this question is in your mind as you're doing the dryland to understand the volume that the swimmers are doing in the water, to say, well, what if their technique's off just a little bit? How is that affecting them? Or the other question to ask too is, let's say their technique's picture perfect, no issues at all. Do you think taking 700,000 of the same movements in a given year has no unintended consequences? I beg to differ. I think that there are unintended consequences, and we see it a lot in the swimmer's posture, the rounded shoulders there. So this is what we need to think about with dryland, is the eternal struggle of the swimmer is the sheer amount of volume that they have to go through just to be in the sport. And then it's another level if they want to be at any elite level of the sport. We go back to, they got to do it faster, better, and more. And more is an easy variable to keep going. Now, we're not in the yardage wars anymore that we were in the 60s, but that still means, even 7,000 yard practices, not that outrageous, in comparison to 10,000 plus, but still, that's a large amount of volume. And 6,000 to 7,000 yard practices are still, almost double of our example here with the 4,000 a day. So the volume is tremendous, and we need to keep that in mind when we're doing any dryland program, that is a constant variable for the athlete who swims that almost no other athlete has in terms of the sheer amount of volume of the same repetition over and over and over again, involving primarily the shoulder, and there are unintended consequences of that you have to then make sure you account for in your dryland program. But a sound dryland program can be what is the other side of that tug of war with the swimmer. And this is why dryland can be so powerful, is the swimmers are always pulling on this side in terms of the volume is always going to be pulling. That's a constant in swimming. Now, if you have no dryland program, this is where the injuries happen a lot faster. This is where posture deteriorates. This is where you're going to cap the ceiling of your swimmer's ability because you're not counterbalancing that tug of war in terms of the volume. You want to use the dryland program to actually counteract the unintended consequences, the negative effects of that much volume. We can't get around it. It's part of the sport of swimming. And so the dryland program specifically needs to be keeping that in mind, that primary focus is pull the rope on the other side to make sure that we keep the swimmer as in line as possible and try to negate whatever things we can from the effects of all that volume. So make sure you understand that this is an eternal struggle for the swimmer and that dryland plays a critical role in helping with that.